Good morning. I hope you had a good first day at Casual Connect. So I'm going to talk about funding. Hopefully this is a good kick-off to the day. I'm just going to overview a lot of the different types of funding out there. I'm sure a lot of the speakers throughout the day will go into a lot more detail. So, just a bit of background about me. Originally a programmer, started my first company at university. I currently have 2 development studios, and I also do consulting, mainly around finance. I've also, through my development studios, raised various types of finance, so hopefully I've got a fairly broad range of experience. So, the funding types I'm going to talk about, got basically 7 different ways of raising finance. I'm going to talk about what each type is, what it's suitable for, try and give you a bit of insight into what they look for, and hopefully a few tips in how to apply for each of them. So, to get started, equity investments. So, various different types. Now, obviously there are other types that exist, but I'm trying to just focus on the ones that are usually relevant for games. So, first one, angel investors. So these are obviously high net worth individuals. They're investing personally. They can invest any amount of money, but often you see them invest at the smaller end in startups, so they often can be a good way to get that first bit of money before going on to raise more money. They are quite difficult in the sense that they don't advertise themselves, and it's always a personal thing, so it's really about meeting somebody who wants to invest in your project and has the money to do so. So it can be very suitable for startups though. They're often happy to take more risk on a project, perhaps. So, to find these guys, it's really about networking. There are people in the games industry that do it. I've raised money from angels before. I've pitched to angels who understand and are from the industry, and angels who aren't. In my experience, any investor who doesn't understand the games industry can be very difficult to pitch to and to raise money from. So, generally, going for ones who are actually in the industry or at least understand it tends to help. So friends and family. I am mentioning this because it's a reality that it's where a lot of people get their first bit of cash from. Not everybody's in that position, and that's a reality, but I think it's important to mention because a lot of startups get that first bit of money from friends or family or even from themselves just to get going. And then you've got venture capital funds. So these come in a huge different range of shapes and sizes. VC funds focus on earlier stage companies than other types of funds like private equity funds. They're all very different. So again, they all have very different things they focus on, different amounts of money, different attitudes to risk. In some examples in Europe, London Venture Partners, Mercia Fund Management, Index Ventures, all these guys invest in Europe in the games industry. Some of them will invest in early stage startups if they have a fund specifically for that. In general, they tend to invest a bit later on once you've already got something going. A good general tip with VCs is that they tend to want 10 times their money back. So if you're pitching, that's the kind of level that you've got to be looking at. And they'll obviously want to exit at some point. So they'll probably want to be in the company with up to about 7 years. That tends to be the norm. And they really do focus on the next and current big thing. So, they're not going to invest in something that's a small area, and they're really tending to sort of see what the next thing is that the industry is focusing on and invest in that. The best way to work that out, look at what VCs have recently invested in. That'll usually give an idea about what they're excited about. I would suggest you just go to VCs who have a background in games. Again, most of the others won't be willing to take the risk on the industry because they don't understand it. And I would also say there is a difference between the US West Coast VCs and European VCs. The West Coast ones are often willing to take more risk, and the UK EU ones can be more cautious. But the catch is that it's often quite difficult for to get a US VC to invest in a European company. So then you've got corporate venture capital funds. We don't kind of hear about these that much, but they do exist, and they're quite important because the difference to other VC funds is that they're interested strategically as well as just financially. So they'll be investing in the same sort of model as a VC, but there'll be a strategic reason for their business. So, for example, Intel has the Intel Capital Fund, which will invest in things that has a strategic benefit to their organization as well as, obviously, a commercial benefit. In terms of who this is for, totally dependent on what you're building. It's not likely to be for a startup because they obviously want to see that you've got something that they need. But it can be fairly early stage if you've got something very revolutionary. And that we do see quite a few of these types of investment in the industry. And then you've got accelerators. So, these guys obviously provide equity investment. They are primarily about support though. So accelerators are very good if you want more than just money. So they tend to be small amounts of funding, but a large program of support. And they're often pre-startup or very, very early stage. And these are great if you're at that real startup phase where perhaps you've come out of university or perhaps you've come out of a company but never made your own game before. These guys are there to be able to support you through that process. They're often residential programs. And, most of the ones out there will give you anything from 5,000 to 100,000 euros, depending on the fund. Some examples, Game Founders, which is in Estonia and a few other countries now, I believe, and Techstars in London. So some of them are game-specific, like Game Founders, some are tech-specific, but there are quite a few out there. So yeah, it's really for startups who want that support and network. The money is usually secondary. So in general, talking about equity investment as a whole, at the end of the day, equity investors are looking to make a return on their money that's more than if they just put it in a bank. That's fundamentally what they're trying to do. And the more risk, the more potential return they want to make back. And investors are people, so generally you need to find someone who's interested in what you're doing, which is why it tends to be easier to go for people in the games industry already. Investors will be in your business for a very long time. It's a partnership, it's not one way. So whilst they're assessing you, and, having been in that position before, you can really feel under pressure. But, you should also be assessing them. Are these people that you want in your business that you want to work with? Can you see yourself working with them for a long time? Often an investor will want to put somebody on the board of your company. That means you've got to work with this person on a very regular basis. Will they genuinely be able to do that? Will you be able to work with them? Will you be able to get value from them that isn't just the money? And make sure you know what exit strategy each type of investor wants. Some have a very clear definition, like venture capitalists usually, but an angel may be willing to stay in the business long term. And just bear in mind that they're investing in your business, not your game. So particularly with VCs, but with all of these guys, they're looking for the growth of the business, the potential for the business, not just a single game. So if you're pitching to these, you need to be looking at the bigger picture and not just talking about one single game. So I'm from the UK, so I'm going to use UK references in terms of kind of how it works in the UK. I'm going to try not to do that too much. But usually governments have some kind of tax incentive for investors. So in the UK, we have something called the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme and the Enterprise Investment Scheme, where if an investor puts in a certain amount of money in a certain type of company, usually startup, they get tax relief, even if they lose the money. So basically it means that their money is a lot less at risk than it was. And some other countries have similar things. This is where government can really help to encourage this level of investment. In the UK, that's made a big difference over the last few years. So make sure, last point really with these guys, make sure that you understand their specific requirements. Every angel, every VC fund has a remit. Particularly VC funds who have got money from outside, they will have requirements. They won't always be able to invest in your game, even if they like it. It may not fit with what they're trying to do. And with VCs particularly, each fund that they have will have a different set of requirements. So make sure to try and understand what those requirements are before you pitch, because A, you can make your pitch better, and B, it may just not be suitable for you. So, project financing, I would say, please feel free to contradict me, is probably the least prolific source of funding these days. I think it used to be a lot more common, but there is a lot less of it in certain ways. We are seeing more of it start to come through, particularly in the UK. A lot of film financiers are now starting to look at the games industry, and it seems to be growing again from that angle, but it's still pretty limited. In the UK, we have things called SEIS funds, which use the government tax incentives and invest in projects. And I know of one fund in the UK which has probably invested in over 80 games projects in the last 3 years. So these can be very popular. And then you've got general project financing. So these obviously invest in the project. They often work by setting up a separate legal entity to hold the IP of the game, so they're investing in this entity over here rather than your business. That suits some developers if they don't want to have investors in their business long term. So it can be quite popular, but in return for that, they will generally take more revenue from the game because they're only in it for one project. So it really depends what works for you. But I would say that there are less of these around. Some of the ones that are around, you've got the Indie Fund in the US and California. You've got Standfast in the UK and Vision Plus who are in Finland. And all of those guys do varying models of project financing. So, public money. Now, obviously, this depends totally country to country. So what I'm going to try and do is cover what is generally the types of public funding out there. So, first one, tax relief. Obviously, in the UK, we now have video games tax relief. France has a similar thing. I'm not sure if any other EU countries do. But this can obviously be very helpful. In the UK and France, you get 20% of all your production costs back, which can be really, really useful. Often there's funding for R&D, so technical R&D. So if you're, rather than just building content, if you're building an engine or any kind of technology along with your game, often governments tend to have pots of money to help with that sort of thing. One of the ones that is EU-wide is Horizon 2020, which is a very large fund that covers all kinds of business, but there is one strand of it that is suitable for small to medium businesses, and there are some games companies that are taking advantage of that. And they are giving into the millions, so it can be quite a good fund, but the process is rather arduous. I think it takes about 8 months usually. So, but, it can be worth it. And then you've got funding for export. So, in the UK, we have grants that are available. So, for example, you can sometimes get a grant to pay for your travel costs to GDC. You can often get funding to pay for your event space, exhibition space at events. And those can be really useful. So often these are kind of almost non-cash things because they're giving you benefits, but they can be really useful and can really add up. And then we've got funding for training. So often, again, depending on what the priorities are within the country, there's often funding available for training of staff, for bringing new people in. We had a real drive in the UK for this a couple of years ago. It still exists, but it really did help particularly a lot of small companies to take on more people and to help to train them up. And then regional funds. So within each country, there's always, well, I believe, in the UK certainly, there's always different funds per region. Usually, if this is linked to the EU, this is to do with the ERDF thing, so basically where they see regions that are more deprived. So in the UK, for example, it's very difficult to get that kind of funding in London, but most other places around the country, there's quite a lot of funding. So depending where you are, there's usually something, and that can either be money or it could be benefits of some kind. And then finally, we've got prototype and development funding, so money for actually making games. Unfortunately, there's not actually that much of this about. Obviously, you've got Tekes in Finland, which is often cited as one of the most successful examples of this. In the UK, we've got a couple, but they tend to be very small amounts of money. So I think this is where we tend to find that there's a shortage. So public money has its place, I believe. There's a lot of debate about how useful it is, whether it should be there. From my point of view, it fills a gap. If you are not at a position yet to go for private money, the public money fills that gap. They are willing to take more risk generally, which means that for startups or for high-risk projects, they can be a really good fit. However, the admin can be extensive, the application process can be extensive. They always have a remit beyond just supporting your game. Usually it's about job creation and economic growth, which means that there may be things that you have to do to get that money. One of the common ones in the UK is that you have to commit to employing a certain number of people, for example. So you've really got to make sure that you want to take that money. It can be great, but it's certainly not an easy way to go necessarily. And you've got to be willing to spend the time on the admin. You've also got to be aware that a lot of the people running these funds don't necessarily understand the industry. And so that can make it quite challenging in pitching or in working with them day to day. So there are some really good examples out there. As I said, Tekes has, I'm not in Finland, so I haven't used it myself, but, that's always cited as a good example. In the UK, we have the UK Games Fund, which again, they tend to understand the industry, so they tend to be quite good to work with. So, debt. I'm not going to go into this section too much because there's loads of different types of debt that you could get. Most people don't like the idea of debt. In reality, it's usually part of a financing plan for a company. There's usually some form of debt in there somewhere. Particularly, sometimes if you go to a VC, part of the money they give you will be debt, not equity. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. But obviously it needs to be used with caution. So there's lots of different types. You've got bank loans, which, as a game developer, I know that that's generally almost impossible to get because as soon as you say the word games to a bank in England, they pretty much put the phone down. You've got overdrafts, credit cards, invoice financing. Then, as I said, you've got investor debt. You can also tend to get loans against things like tax relief. So this is quite a popular one in the UK now. You can claim your tax relief every year or at the end of a project. So therefore, you can get financing to help you cash flow that project. And then you've got, sometimes, and particularly in the UK, you've got startup loans from the government. Now, the reason I mention these is actually because I don't like them. And I want to raise a point, and this is about personal guarantees. So in the UK, the government has this startup loan scheme where they loan you personally, not your business, up to, I think it's £25,000. But it's for you, and it's personally guaranteed by you. Now, my personal belief is that, a lot of the time when I talk to startups, they're worried about percentages that investors are going to take, and that stuff is important. But my bottom line, and having done this from experience, personal guarantees are something I don't think that anybody should require you to take. I think if they do, you shouldn't probably do it. This is about your business. You set up a limited company for a reason. When people, and particularly the government, are asking you to take a personal guarantee, my suggestion would be to walk away. For me, that's my bottom line of where I won't go. So personally, I believe the government loans in the UK are not genuinely helping people. And then again, you've got regional funds. As I mentioned before, often these come as grants, but they can also often come as loans or a mixture of both. And again, they can be quite friendly terms. So, for example, they may charge you no interest at all. They may, charge you a tiny bit, but they tend to be a bit more friendly because they're not in it just to make money. They're probably in it to get the money back to be able to give to someone else. So then you've got work for hire. My first business was a work for hire studio, which I ran for 6 or 7 years, and so I have a slightly jaded view of work for hire. But a lot of developers do, or want to, use work for hire to fund their own projects. If you're building a work for hire studio as a work for hire studio, that's a different matter. I'm talking here in terms of how to get funding from it. We did this for a long time, but it's very hard to make a profit, and it's very, very hard to have enough time to take out of the team and put into your own work, because clients, understandably, are demanding. And when you've got a work for hire model, I personally think it's very difficult to actually take that money and put it into something else. If you do want to go down this road, be patient, because it's going to take a long time. There's going to be a lot of stopping and starting. And I would suggest that you stay very small and very lean. And having tried to do this, we tried to start developing our own IP, and we were kind of 25 people by this point. We found it very, very difficult to do that. So I would suggest staying small, agile, a few people, and really trying to just keep it as lean as possible. And then publishers. So publishers now, it used to be that publishers kind of funded the game, they did the marketing, they did the distribution, it was all very kind of preset. Now, every publisher is different. Some of them do funding, some of them do it early stage, some do late stage, some will only do it once you've got to soft launch, some only do marketing, some only do distribution, or they do any of those combinations. They also tend to not have necessarily a one-size-fits-all, so it depends on your project, and they also tend to change on a yearly basis, depending on what their strategy is. So really the only way to know what a publisher can offer is to speak to them on a fairly regular basis. So, conferences like this are a great reason just to simply catch up with publishers if it's something you might need in the future, and just make sure you understand what they're looking for at the moment. Publishers can be really good. If you've got investment from other places, they can handle the marketing, and I think that's the key. A lot of developers don't have that marketing skill, and you've got to make a decision: is it worth building your skills or bringing in resource to do it, or is it worth giving it to someone else? My suggestion with publishers is that, as with investors, it's a partnership. And, if these guys are going to take a percentage of your game, and they, even for just marketing and distribution, they're probably going to want about 30 to 35% of your revenue. You've really got to know what it is that they're doing. So, they should be transparent with what money they're going to spend. They should be transparent with the strategy that they're going to use to market your game. And that should be something that you work on together and talk about together. If they're not willing to do that, I think, that's need to be cautious. But the ones that do that can be really, really effective. And obviously on the funding, it seems to me that the more we go on, publishers want to get involved later, which is totally right. So you probably find that publishers won't be your sole source of funding. You'll probably need some other funding as well. But funding really is a journey. It's very, very unusual to start a project and get all of the money that you need on day one and then just be able to make the game. That's amazing. That's like the dream scenario. But for most companies, that doesn't happen. Most companies, you get a bit to do something, then you get a bit more to do something else. So you've got to understand where you might need to go. Because, if at the front you take, say, for example, you took an angel investment where they took a huge percentage of your business, you wouldn't then be able to go to a VC because you haven't got enough equity left for them to want to take a stake. So you've really got to think long term about what you might want to do and see it as a journey rather than just a kind of thing that you do and then you make a game. So crowdfunding. Firstly, there's two types. The typical one, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, so project funding. But you've also got equity funding, like seeders. I don't know a huge amount about the equity side, so I'm not going to talk about that too much, but I did do a Kickstarter campaign last year, so I can talk a bit about that. I've actually done whole talks about that, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. But suffice to say that I've raised quite a lot of the types of funding that I've listed here today, and I honestly can say that crowdfunding is the single hardest thing I've ever done, raising finance. I think people are, over the last year, it's become a lot more clear that it's very difficult. I thought I knew how difficult it was going to be. It was even harder. It's not easy to get a lot of money for a start. So if you're only doing it to raise money, then you really need to think about whether to do it or not. We did it primarily to build a community, and that worked for us. But, we spent 6 months planning the Kickstarter, and we had 4 people working during I think it was just under 5 weeks that we ran it for. We got very, very little sleep. My business partner is from a marketing background, and the only thing he came out with was all the rules of marketing went out the window. Nothing that he knew as traditional marketing worked. So all we could do is try to do different things and see what worked. We hit our goal 4 days before the end, so it was particularly stressful. We had an IP that we were working with. So I would urge caution, but also it's a great opportunity if you have the right type of game. The final point on that is that Kickstarter, which is what we did, has evolved a community. That community likes very specific things. I don't believe that was the case when it first started, from looking at what was out there. But if your game does not meet the community that is on Kickstarter already, and they have quite a specific thing, they tend to like board games and PC space games a lot, you've got to bring people to Kickstarter. They are not already going to be there. The worst day we had on our entire crowdfunding campaign was the day that Kickstarter featured us, because we assumed that would bring in loads of people, but the people on Kickstarter who were targeted by that weren't interested in our game. So we had to bring everybody to Kickstarter, to the point where we even had to do a video on our Facebook called How to Do a Kickstarter and What It Is. Because people that liked our project didn't understand Kickstarter. Now, that was an extreme, but, you know, Kickstarter isn't necessarily a community there for you. It's a platform, and you can't take for granted that the people that are already there are going to be relevant for you. That's it. Any questions? Yes?
Thank you for a great overview, first of all. The VCs you talk to that do understand the games industry, what is it that attracts them to our industry as opposed to other industries? Why do they want to invest here and not in something completely different?
It's a good question. Some of them, like London Venture Partners, are actually from the industry. And that's why, you know, they're obviously interested in it because that's where they've come from. Others, in my experience, historically have been in the entertainment industry broadly. So they've always had a film financing or other things like that. So they tend to understand and be interested in the risk and reward models that are there. Yeah, so most of them have been set up with entertainment in mind, and therefore games is an extension of that, I would say. But yeah, I think they like the potential rewards. The potential upsides are huge, so they're willing to take the risk. Anything else? Cool. Thank you very much.